Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. In a moment, we're going to hear further evidence from Mrs. Rita Dexter, but I think first Mr. Millett has something he needs to mention.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good morning, and good morning to members of the panel. Good morning to you both. There's just one small thing, or maybe not such a small thing, that arose on Friday after the examination of Ms. Dexter, and that was the disclosure of the document I'm going to go to her next in her examination. Yeah. Which arose out of the questions I was asking her about the flow of information between the 72D people, so to speak, and the Fire Safety Regulation Department on the other hand. Now, that has given rise to some questions about the LFB's disclosure, and we are investigating that with them at the moment. And I don't want to say any more about it until we've fully got to the bottom of it and until the Brigade has done the same. So I will come back to you as soon as I can with any further information. But needless to say, what I'm going to be going to with her is a newly disclosed document.
Right. Thank you very much. So are we ready now to go on with...
yes, we are. Thank you.
Would you ask Mrs. Dexter to come back in, please? Good morning, Mrs. Dexter.
Good morning.
All ready to carry on?
Yes.
Good. Thank you very much. When you're ready, Mr. Broom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Dexter, good morning.
Morning.
You referred in your evidence on Thursday morning last week to being provided during your tenure as Deputy Commissioner with a set of reports presented to the Directorate Management Board, the DMB, which related to the flow of information as between, on the one hand, the Fire Safety Department and on the other, the operational crews in fire stations. And this was information, and you'll recall the discussion we had about whereby members of the Fire Safety Department would identify during fire safety visit audits what they had found in buildings and relevant information which needed to be sent to the operational firefighters at the stations, and vice versa. Now, you were able, I think, on Friday, as you said you would, to identify a copy of one of those reports. I'm glad to say that it has been provided to the inquiry. I'm going to look at it in a moment. I should also say it has also been disclosed to core participants. Let's go to it. It's at LFB 00122962. And this is a report, Q4 2014 to 15, Station Fire Safety Risk Notification Monitoring. The date is the 12th of May 2015, and it's a meeting between the Director of Operations and the Directorate Management Board, or DMB. You told us last week that the reports came to you more frequently than annually. Just looking at the heading of that report, it's referred to Q4 2014-15. Is that likely to mean that this was a report that was provided to the DMB on a quarterly basis, do you think?
I think that's a reasonable inference, yes.
Right. Now, this is one that we have at this time. Do you know when this, looking at this document, to refresh your memory, this quarterly reporting started?
I don't, Mr. Millett. I didn't, if I'm honest, I didn't recall the fact of this reporting at all until this year. So it was Mr. McGurk's expert report that prompted me to recall the fact of these exchanges of information. And as a result, I said to my legal team, actually, I think there was something that came to my DMB. Can you see what you can get? My impression is that the Brigade hasn't managed to access the papers from my Directorate Management Board, which were held by a particular officer, Neil Marsden. I can't remember when Neil retired. And this one was provided to me in the middle of September. And although it's not during the time that I was in the Brigade, having seen it, I was satisfied in the sense that it provided me the reassurance that I was looking for, that a report of this nature existed, which is what my objective was. Was there such a report? I think I now recall that there was, and this confirmed that. So it's to a Directorate Management Board, but not the Directorate Management Board that was mine. I assume that Dave Brown had a Directorate Management Board subsequently, because he became a director after I left, and this was to his management board.
At all events, is the answer to my question you don't remember?
I don't remember.
No. Now, the title of the report, as you can see, is Station/Fire Safety Risk Notification Monitoring, and we can see that the author of the report is the Director of Operations. At the time of this report, which is 12th of May 2015, I think that was David Brown, wasn't he? AC Brown.
Yes.
Yes. Would it be right to say that before that, and until your departure from the LFB at the end of March 2015, so a couple of months before this document, that function was part of your role? In other words, Dave Brown took over from you?
Dave Brown reported to me, and then in numerous respects took over from me after I left.
Yes. Do you know who was responsible for preparing reports such as this during your time as Deputy Commissioner?
I can't recall.
Now, the summary of the report, if we go to it on the first page, says this. This report shows the number of risk notifications sent between fire safety and fire stations. It differentiates between the origin of the notifications and captures how many have had action taken on them. This report is for the quarter ending 31st March 2015. Is it correct that risk notifications, as the phrase is used there, means, in essence, notification of information that is relevant to a particular building?
Yes.
Yes. And in terms of its fire risks, presumably, which is the risks you were interested in?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, it's right, isn't it, that, tell me if you don't remember this, but the LFB had a policy, namely Policy 784, that governed the sharing of information like this between fire safety operational crews. Do you remember that?
Vaguely.
Vaguely. Well, let's be more specific. Can we go to it? It's at LFB 3012734, please. Now, you can see the title, Stations Notification of Fire Safety Information, new policy number 784, issue date 22nd December 2011, reviewed as current 16th of September 2015, that's after your departure. Owner, Head of Fire Safety, Statutory and Community. Looking at just what I've shown you, does this trigger a recollection? Are you familiar with this policy, do you think?
I recall that there was a policy 784, and it was stations notification of fire safety information.
Right. Now let's look to page 2, please, and let's look at paragraphs 1.1 and 1.2 together. Under 1.1, that's the introduction. And it says this: in the course of their duties, fire safety inspecting officers are likely to encounter matters which should be taken into consideration by operational personnel when pre-planning for operational incidents. When identified, matters of operational relevance will be communicated to the station manager via a form. There will also be instances where station personnel identify fire safety issues that should be communicated to fire safety regulation. Examples include, and then there are 6 bullet points underneath that by way of example, the third of which is complex evacuation strategies, the fourth of which is enforcement issues, and the fifth of which is poor management of fire-engineered premises. And then you can see at the bottom in bold, note, this is not an exhaustive list. And then at paragraph 1.2, this policy details how relevant information should be communicated to the appropriate personnel. Are you able to explain, is it this procedure that is that set out in this policy I've shown you that resulted in the reports to the Directorate Management Board, the DMB, such that we've just seen?
I believe so.
Yes. Now, if we look at section 2, notification to station, it says this: matters of operational relevance identified by fire safety inspecting officers will be recorded. The team leader should agree or amend the action recommended and forward the form SFS A020A2A, note the A at the end, to the relevant station manager, with copies to the borough commander, FSR admin, and the relevant area's support team. support team mailbox. Now, that's what I would call the A form. And then it goes on in the absence of the team leader, etc. And then if you go to section 3 on page 2, lower down, action by station, it tells you what the station should do on receipt of that information. And if you look at 3.1, it says, on receipt of the notification of fire safety information to station form, and there's the A form referred to, the station manager should decide on the action to be taken. And at 3.2, if a joint visit with fire safety is required, the local station should liaise with fire safety to make the necessary arrangements. And then if you look at section 4 on page 3, you'll see that there's a similar reverse arrangement to cater for the flow of information from operational crews to fire safety. So that would be information going the other way. 4.1, where station personnel become aware of information which, in their opinion, needs to be notified to the local fire safety team, they should complete a notification of fire safety information to fire safety form. And then there's the same number, SFS A020A2B, and that's what we can call the B form. And then if you look at 4.2, it says, the watch/crew manager should record the detail of the information on or risk onto the form, together with the action recommended. For example, joint visit with local station to familiarise operational personnel with the installation or risk concerned, site visit by fire safety, information only. And then underneath that, if you scroll down to the bottom of page 3, you can see 5, action by fire safety. It's in the middle of your screen. You see that?
Yes.
5.1, on receipt of the notification of fire safety information to fire safety form, then there's the B form identified. The team leader should decide on the action to be taken. At 5.2, if a joint visit with the local station is required, fire safety should liaise with the local station to make the necessary arrangements. Just looking at what I've shown you there, Ms. Dexter, would you agree that with the exception of the non-exhaustive list, paragraph 1.1 I showed you, with the 6 bullet points, would you agree that there's nothing in this policy, policy 784, that directs or guides either operational crews or fire safety crews or personnel as to what type of information needed to be shared as between them?
So what type of information? So you're saying leave aside the non-exhaustive list?
Yes. Yes, other than the non-exhaustive list. Am I right in thinking that there's nothing in the policy?
Oh, yes.
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 Yes. Do you know, following on from that, whether as a matter of practice, operational crews or fire safety personnel knew what type of information to look out for that ought to be shared, going one way or the other?
Well, certainly the items on the list.
Yes. Other than that, though, beyond that.
Could I look at the list again, please?
Yes, of course. It's paragraph 1.1. If we can go back, please, to page 2 of the document.
I think you're asking me for examples of further types of risks not covered by this list.
Yes.
So, for example, the presence of cylinders. So there were, from memory, in the report that we looked at before this document, the categories reported against were not confined to these 6 items.
No. No, they weren't. And therefore, do you know whether, as a matter of practice, operational crews and fire safety personnel knew, beyond the specifics in the list, what other things to be looking out for? You've given an example of cylinders. Yes. What else would they customarily be alert to?
Let me see. Pool management. So the 5th item here, I'm struggling to decide for myself what the totality of the embraces of poor management of fire engineered premises. but damage to firefighting equipment or firefighting lifts, for example. Cylinders I've mentioned. That's all I can readily bring to mind.
Yes, I mean, to approach the point in a different way, this is a list of examples.
Yes.
Taking the station crews, did the station crews just use this as a tick box list, or did they understand that they were only examples and that they ought to be looking at everything which they thought fire safety should know?
I don't think I could speak to what they did or didn't know. So there was guidance here, and there was experience, and the combination of the guidance and the experience would inform how they responded.
Was there training?
I don't know.
Right. Do you know whether joint visits were ever carried out in practice?
No, I don't know.
Now, we have a copy of the B form, if I can put it that way, which is the form that operational crews were directed to use when notifying fire safety regulation about relevant information. Can we go to that? That's at LFB 3091786. And if you go to page 1 of that document, you can see that the form is called Notification of Fire Safety Information to Fire Safety, to team leader in FSR admin support. So this is going from stations to fire safety regulation, and you can see from station commander. And it says underneath the thick black line, the undermentioned premises have been identified as having special interest to fire safety personnel. Brief details are given below, and further information can be obtained from the officer dealing. And then the watch officer dealing and the telephone number are left as blanks to be filled in, and the address of the premises. And then you can see, if we scroll down a bit, the list, detail of information or risk. And there is a set of boxes, presumably to be ticked. And one can go down them: dangerous substances present, timber frame construction site, complex unusual evacuation strategy used, poor safety, fire safety management evident, prohibition notice not complied with, inappropriate sleeping accommodation, repeated unwanted fire signals, premises information box, contents missing or inadequate, and then other, detailed below. Is it fair to say, just looking at that this was essentially a tick box exercise?
I don't know. It's not a form I've ever seen before.
Oh, okay.
No, it's not a form I've ever seen before, and I don't know the answer to your question.
Right. Do you know whether the list, leaving aside other, perhaps, was one which was approved by the Fire Safety Department?
I don't know.
Do you know, or do you remember any discussion about what should go into this document?
No.
No.
I didn't know it existed.
Right.
It's not only that I've never seen it. I didn't know. I don't think I ever addressed the question of what do the mechanics of the process look like.
No. All right. Do you know? Can you help us? Who did, or who would have done? Whose responsibility was this?
I think David Brown is likely to be the most useful person to ask. Although Dan Daly took up post in fire safety after I left, so I can't speak to Dan's knowledge, but I think Dave Brown is likely to be more helpful in this.
To your recollection, do you remember ever an occasion on which somebody brought to your attention the inefficiency or ineffectiveness of this form as a document identifying to fire station crews defects which ought to be brought to the attention of fire safety?
No. Let's
go back to the Directorate Management Board report we were looking at before at LFB 001222962. And on that, page 3, paragraph 3. If we go to, yes. And you can see at paragraph 3 there, it says this: it is noted that FSR, Fire Safety Regulation, send more notifications to stations than stations do to FSR. Some possibilities for this include some stations not being fully aware of the administrative recording process, alternative communication channels for recent team management changes, and a difference of opinion in what level of information should be referred by the other party. FSR have undertaken for team leaders to scrutinise the quality of FSR notifications to ensure these are all relevant to stations and will provide additional training if required. A consideration has also been given to changing the guidance on reporting lines from stations to teams for these notifications. Now, were any steps taken, do you know, at board level, in other words, the board to which this report was being sent, to iron out these problems so as to make the flow of information from stations to FSR better?
I can't remember.
If we go to Appendix 2 of this document on page 5, we can see that this is the first page of a detailed breakdown which follows over the ensuing pages of the number of notifications by area and by quarter throughout 2014. And it runs for a rolling 12-month period, as you can see, from April 14 to March 15, both months inclusive. And if you go to page 8, we can see the entry for Kensington and Chelsea. There it is, 2/3 of the way down the box. And if you look at that, you can see that over that period, there was a grand total of 6 notifications. You see that?
I do, yes.
Yes. And that would include, am I right, that would include both notifications by station crews to fire safety and by fire safety inspecting officers?
I think the report clarifies that.
Well, let me take it a bit more slowly, because I think I may have jumped ahead a bit too fast. If you go back to page 5, we can see FSR to, this is FSR to station, and page 6 is a continuation of FSR to station.
Yep.
And on FSR to station for Kensington and Chelsea, it's 100%. You see that?
Could you go to the next page?
Yes,
please?
page
Thank you.
6.
It's 100% FSR to station.
Kensington and Chelsea.
Yes.
FSR to station, 100%. And there are 6 notifications. But if you then go to page 7, this is station to FSR, so information coming
The other
way in Appendix 3, same period. And if you go to page 8, there you have Kensington and Chelsea, where the total, although a very small number arithmetically, is 50%. Yes?
Yes.
Now looking at all of those figures, the numbers are low, aren't they? Would you agree with that?
I would.
So you'd expect to see them higher. And looking at the 50%, do you know what happened to the remaining 50% non-compliant notifications?
So the remaining 50% was one notification. I don't know.
Right. Now, I mean, one can do this, but if one goes back to page 7 and casts your eye down page 7, station to FSR, bearing in mind that Kensington and Chelsea was 50%, you have a number of 0% and 1 or 2 under 50%. But 50% on that page, and indeed if you go to the next page, page 8, 50% was in the lower, one of the lower bands, wasn't it? Wasn't the worst, but it certainly wasn't one of the best.
I agree with you, Mr. Millett, but the use of percentages in this table is not very helpful. 50% obviously is one of 2, but I think the numbers matter as much as the percentages.
Well,
isn't that part of the trouble, Mr. Millett? The numbers are so low. I mean, in the case of Kensington and Chelsea, it's 2. So if you fail to comply in relation to 1, you're automatically looking at 50%. Whereas a failure to comply in relation to 1, if the overall number is much larger, nearly as significant.
That's certainly correct. Statistically, that must be correct, but somebody must have thought that a percentage presentation of this data was useful to somebody, otherwise it wouldn't be there. Would that be right?
Well, yes, that would be right, but we saw another example last week where using a percentage in relation to a particular number wasn't actually probably wasn't the best use of the data that could have been made and presented, and I think this is another example of that kind of approach. So I'm not
Yes.
Not trying to do too much that's inappropriate in response to your questions, but the size of these numbers makes the use of percentages not always very helpful.
I see why you say that. The question that follows on from that, whether or not the percentage presentation is or isn't useful to somebody in the LFB, is that come what may, this document would have told the board that there wasn't 100% compliance across the board. In fact, 100% was less rather than more likely. At least you'd know that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for 2 notifications, one might not have been acted upon.
And so the question I have for you is, what was the tolerance level of failure?
There wasn't a prescribed tolerance level. As a consequence of receiving a report of this nature, Dave Brown as head of operations and Steve Turek as head of fire safety would have been asked to go away and have a look at, why data that was concerning was in fact concerning. So to dig a bit further. So that would be done through cascading it through line management tiers.
Yes. I mean, standing back from the granular data, would this report not have suggested to you, if you'd seen it at the time, that the flow of information, certainly from station to FSR, was not functioning very well?
I don't think that's unreasonable. I'm reluctant to commit to not functioning very well because I don't quite know what it means in this context, but so I don't know what the right number. Nobody knows what the best number or the right number should have been, could have been.
Well, the best number would be 100% for all stations.
Oh, on the percentages, yes, but in one sense, it's the numbers that are more important in here because they tell you something about the level of activity and the levels of activity, according to this report and doubtless others, was low.
Yes. So you could take 2 things from this document. Is this right? One, the numbers of levels of activity was very low, and even with those numbers, you weren't getting very high rates of full compliance. I mean, that's what the document is telling us. Would you disagree with that?
I personally wouldn't have set much store against the words percentage compliance.
All right, well, take that column out.
It's a calculation of numbers recorded as action taken by. Yeah. And it's possible, for example, that when fire safety regulation received a notification, that in their view, there was no further action to be taken. So that's not recorded as a possibility, or it could have been that fire safety regulation would know that they had recently taken action in respect of something that had been notified to them. So the percentage compliance, the column is actually very, very unhelpful. But personally, I would have focused on the numbers. Right.
Well, let's focus on a number. Let's look at Westminster.
Yes.
I just want to see if I can get some more insight into this document and how it was used. Total, if you look at the third column from the right, total recorded within rolling 12-month period, 1. Number recorded as action taken by FSR, 0. Percentage compliance, for what it's worth, 0.
Yes.
Now, what does that tell us? Does that not tell us, first of all, that the numbers from FSR to fire safety were so low as to be virtually negligible, and secondly, even those weren't actioned? Does that not tell you that there's a problem in the system?
Mr. Miller, you said from FSR to fire safety.
Yes, that's what this is. This station to fire safety.
Station to fire safety. Yes, it's unsatisfactory. I don't disagree with you.
So what did you do about it, is the question?
David Brown, in the case of stations to FSR, David Brown will have taken it away and talked to the Deputy Assistant Commissioners about what was happening individually in these boroughs and about what happened in order to try and bring about an improvement.
Right. Now, he came onto the scene, as far as this is concerned, after you had left. Before you left, do you remember an incident or instance where you looked at these figures, thought they were unsatisfactory, and went away to talk to the deputy, talk to anybody else about, particularly your board, about what they were showing and what you could do about it?
I don't remember doing it, no, Mr. Millett, but that doesn't mean that I didn't.
Okay. Now, let's turn to something different. Which is the audit tool.
Oh.
Which we discussed, I think, briefly last week. Can we look at the document itself, which you exhibited to your statement, at LFB 000032241? This is a letter dated 5th of January 2015, and it goes, although it doesn't say so, take it from me that it goes to local authorities as a standard form letter. And if you go to page 2, we can see that you were the author of it. Now, we'll come back to this in a moment, but the letter itself, if you go to page 1, in the third paragraph, introduces the audit tool, which was enclosed with the letter, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And the audit tool itself starts at page 3 of this same document, and it has an introductory text, and you could see a rather striking picture of a tower block in the shape of a question mark on the left-hand side. Now, just to set this in context, some people looking at this document may be reminded of documents that were sent the previous July 2014 to local authority councillors. There were 2 guides which went out, LFB 000 1294 and 1295 for those who are interested in it. But do you remember that process?
The 2 guides?
Yes.
Yes, it was. Yes. So this branding was part of the Know the Plan campaign.
Right, thank you. Now, but it is at this point, I think, January 2015, so some 6 months later, that this document comes out to the local authorities. If you go to the introductory test, it says this. London Fire Brigade is concerned about the arrangements in place for protecting the fire safety precautions of a building, especially if it's been refurbished or if any modification or maintenance projects have been carried out. In the Brigade's experience, buildings can and do become compromised in fire safety terms by works carried out. These works can be high or poor quality. They might be carried out for very desirable reasons, but sometimes many different types of works can unintentionally damage the fire safety arrangements of a building. Even something as simple as repainting a surface can be significant. And then at the bottom of the page, if you just scroll down to that, you can see that you explain that the audit tool has 3 parts. And the first bullet point is questions, short set of questions for those with governance responsibilities, especially councillors. Now, just standing back, it's right, isn't it, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the audit tool came out of the LHWG, the Lacknell House Working Group's work?
That's correct.
Yes. Was it developed by the Fire Safety Department or were other departments involved, do you remember?
It was mostly developed by me, but working with fire safety and other colleagues.
And it was designed, I think, to be used by local authorities, is this right, when undertaking any kind of refurbishment or modification or retrofit?
Yes.
Yes. And to be clear, was it the intention that local authorities and housing organisations should complete the audit tool for their own internal risk management purposes and governance purposes?
Yes.
And then was the idea that the LFB would then essentially check it?
No.
Not?
It was for self-assurance.
It was for self-assurance?
Yes.
So as part of enforcement under the RRO, was the idea that the LFB wouldn't look and see whether or not the audit tool had been used?
No.
Right. Do you know why that is?
it's a very good idea. Nobody ever proposed it.
Right.
It didn't occur to me.
So the document would go to the local authorities and they would then decide for themselves what to do with it. So you
Yes.
had no idea whether it was even being read.
No. The borough commanders were involved in. The borough commanders were aware that we were going to, as it were, launch it, and I can't remember whether I asked them to follow it up or liked to imagine that they would, but there was the potential for that to happen.
Yes, yes. Now, when developing the audit tool and councillor guides, do you remember what you and your fire safety colleagues understood to be the Grenfell Health Working Group's primary concerns that you were seeking to address by this document?
I think members, particularly Valerie Shawcross, were keen to encourage more political ownership of some of these issues at a local level, and wanted local authority members, councillors, to have resources available to them to help with that. So the guides in the July were, as it were, the first examples of that. So there was a guide to ask questions in council meetings, and there was a guide to ask on, for example, questions to ask on estate visits.
You say political ownership. What do you mean by that expression? Do you mean councillors, elected councillors,
Yes,
taking more direct responsibility for the fire safety in refurbished buildings?
Appropriate to their responsibilities as councillors, yes. So I think one of the questions on the next page says something like, have you told your officers that your buildings ought to be at least fire safety compliant after the works as they were before?
Yeah.
So that would be an example, I think, of where a local authority could adopt a policy. It could say, we want, as a matter of policy, we don't want any of our buildings to be, to use the term I used last week, sabotaged as a result of well-intended programmes. So we want some assurance that at the end of maintenance works or refurbishment works or whatever, the building will be at least as fire safety compliant as it was before.
And did those concerns arise out of something that the working group had found specifically at Lacknell House?
No, I think not directly Lacknell House. I think it would be more accurate to say it was the consequential work. So the feedback from the high-rise forum, the things we were told when we went to the meeting of the London District Surveyors Association. I think I have a recollection of going to a seminar, a private sector-led thing, where there were a number of speakers, and they offered some insights into what they believed was happening, particularly with building control. So we had a number of we had the benefit of feedback, as it were, from a number of different sources about what might be happening with building control, and we sought to bring all of that together and try and understand what it meant for something that we could do.
Now let's look at LFB 30's27799. This is an email from Sandra Ogist, who I think was your PA.
She was.
To you, actually. Good morning, boss. Please see the above, which was sent out. And what's more important, I think, is the second email down, which she sent out on the 12th of January 2015 to some individuals, some of whom are familiar. Steve Leader is familiar, Richard Welch, Patrick Goulbourne, David Lindridge, etc. This is an internal document, isn't it? An internal email.
Yes, it looks like borough commanders.
Borough commanders, yes. And it would appear, is this right, that it was simply being sent to those borough commanders on a for information basis?
Sandra didn't say other than that, but it wasn't their first introduction to it. So there had been prior exchanges with the borough commanders about the fact that it was coming.
Right. Now, we see in this email, at least, no instruction to borough commanders on how they should individually be using the tool in their dealings with councils or housing providers. Is there?
No, there isn't.
No. So would it be right that the audit tool's success was going to depend entirely on the proactive and voluntary uptake by councils and housing providers?
Largely so, yes.
And in the absence of any feedback or monitoring or auditing by the borough commanders, the LFB wouldn't know whether it was successful or had any impact at all, or whether it had just disappeared into the ether.
Well, I don't think we ever precluded the possibility of doing that. So we may not have set that out at the beginning of the process, but there was no prohibition on us going back 3 months later and saying, and what happened next.
Now, this is January 2015. Of course, you left at the end of March, not long later. But was there any consideration of going back in those few months and finding out what impact the audit tool that was being sent out had?
I can't say I've considered it, no.
Right. Was there any consideration during your time ever given to how the audit tool would feed into the 7.2D process?
No.
Why is that?
There was, certainly the section on governance in the audit tool. I'm finding it difficult to imagine there was any synergy between the things we were asking members about in governance terms and 7.2Ds. I feel rather stupid that I can't remember what the titles of the other two sections were in the audit tool, but I can't.
Well, that's okay. Let's go back to the audit tool then, at the last document. If we can just look at that. LFB 30322241, page 4, I think, is where we want to go with the first of the audit tool pages.
Okay. Oh, yeah, so
We go to page
cross-disciplinary.
4, yes.
Yes, so I think the same about cross-disciplinary working and internal processes. Today, I'm finding it difficult to imagine any synergy there with 7.2D visits. The third section. Could we go to the third section?
Well, that's
please?
what I was going to show
Yes.
you. That's on page 5.
That's got potential, but that's I think. But I'm acting on memory now.
Well, no, we can I think, help you better.
Thank
Page
you.
5 at the bottom is section 3, and if you scroll to page 6, you'll see it continues.
Yes.
And they're fairly broad questions.
Yes.
But for example, and of course officers are housing officers, not LFB officers, just to be clear about that. But
And not just housing officers, Mr. Millett.
no, indeed, councillors.
No, they could be. When I was in Barnet, I was the project director for a new build project in Finchley, which was a new arts centre, for example. It was a multi-purpose building, an arts centre with some retail and with private sector housing above it. So I wasn't a housing officer, and in fact that experience was useful to me in this context. So it wasn't just housing. It could be another project. So I think in the pilot for it, I think Camden maybe looked at a library project. Maybe it was a new build library. I don't think it was the British Library, but
Right.
it wasn't just housing.
You mentioned project directors, I think, drawing on your own experience.
A long time ago, yes.
Was it the intention of the LFB that this audit tool should be given to local authority or ALMO or TMO officers overseeing refurbishment projects?
Yes.
Yes. Now, going back to my question on the 72D, if we look together at page 6, look at paragraph 3.4. There's the question, how did officers guard generally against improvements which could compromise the fire safety features of the building? And there are other examples as well, 3.5, 3.6, 3.7, use of incorrect materials. Just taking those questions which are posed to the groups of people that you've identified, was there any information given to station officers that on 72D visits after January 2015, LFB officers ought to be asking the same questions?
No.
Why is that?
It wasn't ever suggested. It wasn't a proposition that occurred to me. And now I'm moving on to thinking about how appropriate would it have been, which is not what you're asking me to do, so I'll try and stop.
No, I'm just trying to, yes, I mean, I just trying to get a feel for the thinking at the time, where you've already got a system of flow of information between 72D people and fire safety people. Fire safety developed the audit tool. It goes to the local authority and the group of people you expected it to go to. I'm just trying to work out why nobody, as it appears at the time, thought, well, this is something that station officers also ought to have in their hands so that 72D visits are effective.
No, so we didn't, and I wish you'd been there to make the suggestion at the time, but it wasn't suggested at the time, and both fire safety and colleagues from operational response were involved in the development of this. But I think the way that oddly, my Barnet experience with the Arts Centre in Finchley did weigh on how I thought about this. And one of the things that I realised is that if I'd been in that role, still in that role in Barnet, and a member of the council, a councillor from Barnet had said to me, Mrs. Dexter, how did you guard against improvements or actions in this development which would compromise fire safety? My thought process was actually that's a question that would make me quite fearful to be asked as an officer, because it was a genuinely probing question, and so it was that well, you may not think so, I'm sorry. It was a broad question, but it was in considerable more detail than happens generally. In the context of that project, I was certainly never asked any of those questions, and based upon what we were hearing from people at the High Rise Forum and the District Surveyors Association and other places, these types of questions simply weren't being asked, which is why one saw some of the outcomes that we saw.
Yes. And I'm just seeing whether you would agree with me in characterising that gap, if you like, as evidencing a lack of joined-up thinking within the LFB, as between fire safety on the one hand and station managers conducting information gathering under 72D on the other.
No, I don't accept that it characterises that. I genuinely would have to think harder about the join with 72D. I think the risk is that you're imbuing 72Ds with more capacity than they could ever reasonably have had. Maybe with a different workforce, with more training. In that respect, we could have had bigger aspirations for 72D, but you know from the evidence that's already before you that trying to achieve enough and sufficiently and of sufficient quality 72D visits was already an uphill battle, and I'm just not sure how much more weight we could have put on 72Ds at that time. But I'm also admitting that it wasn't something I thought about.
Now,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Millett. Just help me with this, if you could. I'm beginning to get the impression that 72D was seen to extend only to visits by station crews to particular buildings to see what they could discover. Is that how it was understood?
Yes, I'm not sure what follows from that. So Dave Brown will be able to in much more detail talk about the approach to 72D visits, but certainly after Lakanal House and the review of Policy Note 800, there was a desire to A, increase the number of 72Ds, B, improve their content, and C, make them better targeted.
My point's a slightly different one.
Okay.
I'm getting the impression that the LFB considered that 72D was entirely fulfilled by sending station crews to visit buildings. And you keep using the word visits, see?
Okay. But it wasn't, the visit wasn't an end in itself. The point about the visit was to enable pre-planning and to improve the information in the operational database, and which then was available to crews on the MDT on their way to incidents.
I understand that. But my reading of 72D suggests that it's completely open-ended. It imposes an obligation on the Fire and Rescue Service to obtain information. It doesn't say how you obtain it.
No.
So sending crews to visit places is one way of obtaining information, but not the only possible way. Is that right?
Yes. And you've prompted a recollection, but it's at no more than the level of recollection that at some point we gave consideration to asking responsible people to provide information. I'm sure that is in, either in my witness statement and the documents attached, or certainly elsewhere. So yes, we did give consideration to that, although I wouldn't be telling the truth if I said it was methodical or well followed through as a proposition. But consideration certainly, at some point there was some discussion about using that as an opportunity.
And was it actually taken, that opportunity?
I don't recall, I'm afraid, sir. I don't recall. If it was, it's not in my consciousness. So a colleague might be better informed, but I think it's less likely.
You see, one might have thought that if you identify the information that you would find helpful, the next step would be to decide how to obtain it.
Oh yes.
Which might involve a visit, but might not. It might involve a letter.
It might. It might involve knowing who the responsible person was that you had to write to, and I already touched last week on the difficulty of reliably knowing who those people were, or even the addresses of the buildings where there should be a responsible person. So it was not without its difficulties.
No, I'm sure that's right, but I think from what you've told us that I'd be right in thinking that although the concept of obtaining information by means other than visits to building was there in a general way in people's minds, not very much was done to pursue it.
Visits dominated our thinking about 72D visits.
Well, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Yes, no, thank you. Now, can I show you, please, next, LFB 3073159. This is an email chain among, I think, help me, the fire engineering group in June 2015, after your time. Now, the subject matter, as you can see from the top, is Lakanal Refurbishment Audit Tool, Action for AFSMS. And it's from Lindsay Seal to Chris Callow, Gareth Steele and Christopher Lloyd-Williams. 30th of June 2015. And Lindsay Seal says this: "Hi Chris, as per my previous email attached, I don't see this as a building control tool and therefore would not recommend any reference within FSIGN 501. And just pausing there, what is FSIGN 501? Am I right in thinking that it's the Fire Safety Information and Guidance Note number 501?
I believe so.
Right, and is that the Fire Safety Department's version of Policy 501, which is, I think, entitled, and help me, Consultation with Local Authority Building Control Officers and Approved Inspectors?
I don't know.
Right. All right. Well, picking up where we left off, if we read on, he goes on to say, I'm also not clear on what the intended purpose of this is and how we can effectively monitor its use and any compliance. I, of course, appreciate the issue and the need to address the lack of potential consideration of fire safety precautions when undertaking refurbishment projects, but not sure this is the most effective way of educating / supporting local authorities, etc. As mentioned before, FEG, I think that's the Fire Engineering Group, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. FEG weren't part of the original consultation on the creation of this document, so are a little unclear on the intent and expectations on fire safety staff in terms of engagement. Is it right as a fact that fire engineering were not consulted on the development of the audit tool?
I'm sure I didn't personally involve the fire engineering group, but the then manager for fire safety regulation was involved in the development work, and I would have expected him to take that back within the department.
Who was that?
Mark Andrews.
Mark Andrews.
And I have a version of consulting Nick Coombe for a view. So I can't speak to what happened within fire safety regulation, but it's not the case that fire safety regulation were left out of the development of the tool.
This is the Fire Engineering Group.
Accepted. I think Mark was the manager for the department, including the Fire Engineering Group at that time.
Right. I mean, do you know why, as Lindsay Seal is saying, the Fire Engineering Group were not consulted on the development of the audit tool?
No.
You don't know. I mean, do you accept that it would have been extremely helpful to have had their input?
Not inevitably. So I remember Nick Coombe's response so clearly, because Nick's response to me in response to one of the drafts was, why don't you just ask them if they've complied with AB approved document B? You know, Nick's position, I had the greatest time and still do for Nick. Very impressive officer. But Nick said, you know, just ask them about compliance with approved document B. But that's not what members wanted. Members wanted something which would seek to take it a bit further, to ask that question about, well, you know, a member in Barnet might have said to me, are you sure that Arts Centre in Finchley complies with a approved document B? And I could easily have said yes, and it lay there. But members wanted some questions which would facilitate further probing.
Yeah. And was any consideration given to the relationship between the audit tool and the other work of the Fire Safety Department, either before or during the audit tool's development?
No, because in one sense it was facing the other way. So although Lindsay Seal is also a first-class officer, when she says she's not sure it's the most effective way of educating or supporting local authorities, I'm not sure Lindsay's ever worked in a local authority, and I have, and I know I was clear about how people like me in a local authority would feel if a member said, just tell me a bit more about that. You've answered the question, does it comply? Yes. But a few more probing questions are always good for local authority officers, in my view, and that's what we were trying to give to members.
Now, let's go to an earlier email chain at LFB 00116 please. And let's go straight in that run to page 3. And here is, if you go to page 3, an email of the 6th of September 2013 from you to a number of borough commanders.
Yep.
And I think also to the operations and mobilising email group. Is that right?
It says that. For the life of me, I can't remember who they were, but yes. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't remember. I can't. Sorry, it's strange to me that they're on that list, but there they are.
Right. Morning all. In the context of members' consideration of the lessons to be learnt from Lakanal, some members have asked us to consider whether there is a piece of work to be done which, quotes, audits, unquotes, whether significant refurbishment projects in high-rise residential premises have been sensitive to considerations of fire safety integrity. We're not sure if this is a good idea in principle, whether anyone would cooperate with us, or whether we have the skill and tools to undertake it. But we have to look into the idea and report back. And you go on to discuss a meeting and go on, in fact, in the second paragraph, in summary, to request from borough commanders any anecdotal evidence of significant refurbishment projects. First, do you recall sending this email?
I've seen it as part of the preparation for today.
Right. And if we look at the, if we go back to page 1, scroll up to page 1 and look at the penultimate email on that page, you can see that there's an email from Nicholas Strong on the 15th of November 2013 to Mark Andrews, forwarding the chain up the chain. Mark, is the message from the DC at the start of this string something that we ought to be discussing at our meeting on Wednesday? And now if you look up the page, he goes back to Nicholas Strong and brings in Nicholas Coombe and Steve Churick. Thanks, Nick. Most definitely. Steve, why has this request for info not gone to our TLs? I think TLs are team leaders, aren't they? Excuse me. And then if you go up the page, you can see at the top of the page, Steve Churick responds to Mark Andrews, same day, confidential. Thanks for this, Mark, but we are clearly not the only people she omitted to include in her request. I will raise this with her next week, but suggest that this is another example of her freelancing and information gathering to write yet another report herself, as with the fire safety legislation report. Now, obviously you didn't see that email at the time. Would it be fair to say that your desire to raise awareness of fire safety matters turned into freelancing, as is described there, at the expense of involving other members of the LFB?
No. You're right, I didn't see this at the time. I've seen it more recently. One of the things that I regret is that I didn't send that first email to the team leaders. I think I've learnt as a result of this inquiry that I could and should have paid more attention to the work of local fire safety teams. But Mark Andrews could easily have said in response to this email, actually, I've been fully involved in this project, because he had been. At the end of the audit tool, there's a risk matrix. And that came not from me. That came, I'm not a designer of matrix. It's just not something that I would do. Mark Andrews very specifically proposed that addition to the audit tool. Mark was very fully involved, and he could have passed that on.
Mm. Did Steve Churick raise the issue that he's referring to in his email to Mark Andrews at any time with you?
I can't remember. I don't recall him doing so, no.
Right. Right. Let's look then at something slightly different, which is the consideration of modern methods of construction and highly insulated buildings in the context of fire spread. Can I ask you to start, please, with LFB 30084762? This is an email between you and DAC Graham Ellis in March 2014, and it's entitled Potential Rekindling Wardour Street, and you're given it an incident number. And if we go to the bottom of page 2 of this email run, and over onto page 3, we can see that it starts with an email from Graham Ellis to you on the 11th of March 2014, and he says this, not wishing to insult your intelligence if you already know this, but Kingspan, referred to in this report, is the proprietary name for foil-backed insulation board used in modern construction to improve insulation and meet building regs. And Kingspan is in quotes there. It's the same as Celotex, Ecotherm, Extratherm, and a range of other major proprietary insulation slabs. It generally looks like this, and is used behind plasterboard, below floorboards, floor sheets, and in roof lining. The thickness can vary from 25 millimetres to 150 millimetres. And then, if you go over the page, you can see that there's a picture of Kingspan insulation. And 3 paragraphs down, you can see that DAC Ellis goes on to say this. Perhaps we need to empower our commanders with the knowledge that if they can reasonably justify any cutting away, we will support them in any claim for damages done. It all comes back to training and ensuring that CBTs and guidance docs are reinforced by regular practical demonstration using modern building materials. That does not happen as far as I am aware. The day when a significant minority of our operational workforce were skilled tradespersons with working knowledge of building construction have long gone. Now, why was it that DAC Ellis from the Operations Resilience and Training Directorate was raising these issues with you at this time? Do you remember?
So it's the right way. Because he was flagging something which, he asked me a direct. No, he didn't ask me a direct question. Because he wanted to provide me with some knowledge that he thought it was important for me to acquire. I met Graham Ellis when he was station manager at Soho in my very early days in the Brigade, and for the rest of my time in the Brigade, Graham Ellis was always a very important source of information and advice. So it wouldn't be very unusual for Graham to seek to teach me something that he might have thought I didn't know. He had a specific question there, and because from time to time Graham raised things while he was in this role, so I think he was DAC Operational Assurance at this time, because of my role as chair of ODCB. So I mentioned last week the idea of pushing at an open door or pushing at a closed door. Graham's view was that generally he was pushing at an open door if he raised things with me.
Right. Yes, he had a specific question there. Let's see your response. It's at page 2, if we go to the top of that page, where you go back to him on the same day, about half an hour later, and you say, it doesn't insult my intelligence at all. And in the third paragraph, you say, I agree with your wider point. It cannot be rocket science to make that happen, and we will just have to find a way to make it work in the context of an outsourced service. It needs some thought and will. Now, just pausing there, you're referring there, I think, to the delivery of practical training on modern building materials in the context of the training having been outsourced to Babcock. Have I got that right?
I'm sorry, would you ask that again, please, Mr.
Yeah,
Willett?
let me try it a different way. Is what you were saying here that you agreed that there should be practical training delivered to officers on the subject of modern building materials, but in the context of the training having been outsourced to Babcock?
I'm not sure what the effect of adding those words in the context of outsourcing to Babcock to be.
Well,
but if I may leave those to one side, I'm not sure that my response was that fine. So I think I was agreeing with him that it presented a training need, but it wasn't a more refined response than that at this stage.
When you said we will just have to find a way to make it work in the context of an outsourced service, what did you mean?
That is a very particular thing to have said. No, sorry, now I understand your question. better. I can't recall what prompted me to make that point in particular. It seems an odd point to have made, looking at it here now, but why will I have done that? Maybe you go back down to Graham's email, please?
Yes, of course. Page 2, the foot of the page. And then over to page 3. Page 3 is where he
Yes.
refers to the subject of training.
I can't explain it, Mr. Miller. If Graham doesn't provoke the outsource question, and so I'm at a loss to recall why I mentioned it. I'm sorry.
I mean, let me suggest something and see what you think about it. But might it suggest that at the time, suggesting new training, practical training, to firefighters or station personnel was not easy, given that the whole of the training structure had been outsourced to Babcock.
I don't think it was not easy to propose new training, but it certainly may not have been easy to secure its delivery. So the strengths and weaknesses of the Babcock arrangements were recognised within the brigade at that time. So I don't think it was that it was hard to ask, but it was not certain you'd get what you wanted or you'd get it quickly enough.
Right. Now, you say at the end of the sentence we were just looking at, we just go back to page 2, please, second paragraph of your email of the 11th of March. You scroll up, please. In the third paragraph there at the end, you say it needs some thought and will. What happened with the suggestion to provide regular practical demonstrations, as DAC Ellis put it, on modern methods of construction and materials to frontline staff?
So I saw this correspondence again for the first time last week, and I'm unimpressed by my own recollection of what happened next. So Graham raised a specific point about support for officers who ordered cutting away, and just reading this, officers who decide to cut away and maybe damage somebody's property more than they thought it needed to be. And I have no recollection of how I took that forward, so I reproach myself for that.
Well, let's see if we can take it forward on the documents then.
Yes.
If we go to page 1, and Mr. Chairman, I should just say I've got about 5 minutes or so on this run of emails, and after that would be convenient for a break.
Yes, well, it'd be better to finish these, wouldn't it?
Yes, thank you very much. Can we go to page 1 then, please, and look at Mr. DAC Ellis's response?
Yes.
Now, it's a long email, and he covers a number of matters, but I just want to look at the third paragraph there with you. He says this: by now, Babcock training should have a rig at training venues where they can demonstrate how fire can spread undetected through voids or shafts, and a selection of modern building materials such as kingspan, which they can show to students to highlight the dangers associated with concealed fire spread. It wouldn't even have to be a full-size rig. Even a glorified Wendy house would do the trick. This will become more critical if we move to reinstate recruit training. Now, just pausing there, we'll come back to that, the rest of that in a moment, but did you take any steps to further his suggestion, to take it further forward?
No.
Why is that?
I don't know.
And if we look at the penultimate paragraph on that page, we'll need to scroll down. He says, in the paragraph that starts, I'm struggling with the Lacknell survey instrument, you can see there's a paragraph break, and after that he says this: I do fear that the vastly experienced and savvy old-fashioned district surveyors in local authority building control teams have been replaced by highly academically qualified technicians, in italics, who seem to lack a basic working understanding of the building trades. I think there may be exceptions where there has been a catastrophic failure in the overall design of a refurbishment, but in the main, many of the fire safety problems emanate from poor workmanship, compounded by poor or absent quality control by surveyors stroke building inspectors. A typical example would include incomplete or shoddy fire stopping around service shafts. The fact is that even the more legitimate major contractors, in italics, invariably employ a plethora of subcontractors, many of whom have little safety knowledge and even less desire to do the best job. Now, reading that email, at the time, did you give any consideration to how the LFB could tackle the problem of fire safety issues arising as a result of poor workmanship?
My recollection is that it was a poor workmanship. There are reports to the Lakanal House Working Group which report to members that local authorities, some of those that we were engaged with, were concerned about poor workmanship. So I'm certain the phrase poor workmanship appears in one of my reports, and I, probably in that same report, told members what Southwark Council had been exploring to try and share with their other local authority colleagues their experience of poor workmanship, but there were legal barriers to doing so, and that's explained in the report. But I realise that you asking me, Mr. Millett, requires me to direct my thinking to what did we do about conveying the fact of poor workmanship internally and including to frontline crews. And I'm just not familiar with whether there were any training packages that address that.
We'll come to that in just a moment, but at the time when you raised this question, or saw Mr. Ellis raising this question with you, did you give any consideration to whether this kind of problem was a problem that operational crews needed to be aware of when conducting 7.2D information gathering?
No. No is the answer, and that is partly because, and you may reasonably say it was a fault. I was focusing on, as it were, trying to encourage more rigorous monitoring and regulation by the people who might address the problem of poor workmanship, i.e. the people who were commissioning projects.
Through the audit tool?
Through the audit tool and, the discussions with the High Rise Forum, chairing David Crowder's presentation with the district surveyors and others. So we were doing something that we probably hadn't done before, which was trying to reflect back to those who were in a better position to control the likelihood of poor workmanship or poor refurbishments, and trying to make them aware of the detail of what had happened at Lakanal House to be a lesson for the future.
Would you agree that that effort was something which should have been the subject of training to frontline station-based personnel so that they at least understood the risks involved in a refurbishment and in the use of modern building materials such as Kingspan, so that they could take account of those when formulating operational tactics?
Yes.
Yes. Now, the inquiry understands that in late 2015, so after your departure in the March of that year, DAC Ellis was involved in the production of a training package on highly insulated buildings to be released in conjunction with an operational news article. My question for you is: were you ever made aware before your departure of the intention to develop that package?
No.
No. Or the reasons for the development?
Before I left, no.
No. Right. Mr. Chairman, I have some maybe 20 minutes or so left with the witness, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe 30. But now would be a very convenient moment.
Yes, well, I think we probably ought to have a break, so we'll take a break now. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 12. And as before, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone while you're out of the room. All right? Thank you very much. Thank you. 25 to 12, please. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Mrs. Dexter to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, ready to carry on, Mrs. Dexter?
Yes.
Yes, yes, Mr.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Dexter. Can I just ask you first to be shown MET 3077774? And I'm doing this as part of a set of general questions I'm going to ask you now about fire safety, leading on to your November 2017 submission. Now, what I'm showing you here is Dan Daly's statement that he gave to the MPS, the Metropolitan Police, in November 2020. And can we go to page 12 in that, please? And let's just look on page 12 in the first paragraph there, where he says in the third line, second line, in my experience in the LFB and the role of Assistant Commissioner for Fire Safety, I think that it would be fair to say that issues raised through fire safety are not always at the top of the list. Do you agree with that comment?
The top of which list? It's not a very helpful comment, and it wouldn't be. So if I was forced to have a view about a very imperfect claim, in my view, the answer would be no.
Well, you say what list? I mean, he's obviously talking generically. What he means
Yes.
is not always a priority, or the priority. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, it's not always the priority. Sometimes there are other priorities. Yes, yes. The priorities, will be time of the year and context dependent.
Why would fire safety not always be at the top of the LFB's priority list?
Because nothing is always at the top of the list. That's why I think it's a very imperfect statement. I think I understand the sentiment that Dan is conveying, which is fire safety doesn't have the same profile as operational response. I think everybody who goes into fire safety comes to think, it's potentially the most important thing that the brigade does. So I think maybe Dan feels like that. Certainly Neil Allbell, who became Assistant Commissioner while I was still there after Steve Turek, I don't know that Neil thought he was going to really enjoy the fire safety job, but he did. He was thrilled by it. He thought it was really, really interesting and important. But I suspect you have to be in it to get to really understand what a interesting and important set of responsibilities it amounts to. I think it was my impression. I think I said last week. Maybe for years it was a bit of a sideshow.
Let's look at your own words in your submission to the inquiry that you made in November 2017. It's at LFB 3040774. And on the first page there, in the last paragraph, you say this: I feel strongly that the current governance arrangements for fire safety management are deficient because, in advance of the Grenfell Tower fire, there was both available intelligence about refurbishment risks and advice to those in vital decision-making roles about the sort of questions they should pose about the fire safety aspects of the refurbishment process.
A refurbishment
projects. But on the face of it, and not only in relation to Grenfell Tower, the availability of this material was not impactful. To be clear, it is not my suggestion, you go on to say, after the next sentence, to be clear, it is not my suggestion that anyone willfully ignored available advice, but I do believe that many public service leaders struggle with the idea that fire safety management is a topic where they can achieve important interventions and where they can take action to reduce fires, or the severity of fires, if we go over the page, and where they can take action to prevent deaths and injuries. Many fires and fire deaths are preventable. People working in the fire service understand that, but many of those they work with do not. despite the actions taken by individual fire brigades to disseminate information and to offer advice about preventive strategies. Now, in the last few lines there, are you referring there to your work that you did on the audit tool?
No, no. And I wrote this in 2017 before I knew I'd be a witness and before I've learnt as much as I've learnt in the last 4 years. I think when I wrote that, I was thinking about political governance and management arrangements. So in that last couple of sentences, it's more likely that I had in mind that old people were dying from smoking-related deaths in their home, where they had a carer going in 3 or 4 times a day, and where those elderly people were demonstrating that they were dropping cigarettes on their clothing, getting cigarette burns, disposing of cigarettes in waste paper bins lined with plastic carrier bags, and that this just seemed unremarkable to many people.
Right.
So yeah, I think it was probably more that.
Can we go back to page 1 and look at the third line?
Yeah.
Or second line there and third line there. You say, in advance of the Grenfell Tower fire, there was both available intelligence about refurbishment risks and advice to those in vital decision-making roles about the sort of questions they should pose about the fire safety aspects of refurbishment projects. What available intelligence are you referring to there? What was the available intelligence about refurbishment risks?
The knowledge that every local authority leader in London could and should have had about what happened at Lakenhall House. But also, I think I published a number of reports, either to the Strategy Committee, but also to external bodies, which included what I described as pen pictures. Here are 10 examples of fires that the Brigade has encountered in the last 10 years, and they were often quite different in nature, but were intended to illustrate the main features of incidents which may not always have been apparent before. So, and we did a number of other things within the Brigade over time. So where there were fire deaths, I think we wrote to the council leader and the chief executive saying, look, this happened in your borough, and that may be the elderly person with cigarettes, but it might have been something where structural fire safety was involved. We did an accumulation of things over time to try and make these issues not invisible in the way that we felt they had been.
And when you refer to refurbishment risks, in the third line in this document, would I be right to think that you were referring there to fire safety failings arising as a result of refurbishment works on high-rise buildings, which may compromise that building's compartmentation?
Well, not just high...
You're including that?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Now turn the page, please, to page 2 in the third paragraph there. Let's look at that together. You say there, overall, my main points can be summarised as follows, and then in the third paragraph you say, first, the discovery of building failure following a fire is not exceptional. Grenfell Tower and Lakenhall House are not, in that respect, rare examples. In 2014, as Deputy Commissioner, I reported to the LFIPA Lakenhall House Working Group that between 1st September 2010 and 31st August 2013, 82 primary fires were identified as involving a structural fire safety failure. These 82 incidents have been reviewed to identify the following. And then you set out a long list of bullet points of statistics, which you can see, of which at the bottom you can see that 6 were in a purpose-built block of 4 to 9 stories, 7 were in a purpose-built block of 10 or more stories, and at the very top of the list, 50 were dwellings. That's just during that period. To be clear, you're referring here, I think, to total building failure due to structural defects and the substantial progression or spread of a fire, are you?
No, I don't think so. No, not total failure.
Not total failure?
No. So the The data came from the Brigade's database. There's a structure for the submission of data to, it was then DCLG, and there was provision within that scheme to notify DCLG about structural fire safety failure. And I think I might have mentioned this last week. I think there was a kind of drop-down menu then where either the station or fire investigation could, as it were, elaborate on the detail of that.
Right. But would you accept that this would show, or did show, that the LFB had within it the knowledge as at November 2013, the date of that report, that building failure or structural failure was not exceptional as a result of a fire?
If building failure might include or would include a private domestic home where somebody had had an extension and there was a fire in that extension and the smoke spread through to the first floor because of insufficient fire stopping, then I think the answer is yes. So, I think I mentioned it last week. That's an incident that, for whatever reason, remains firmly in my mind. The words building failure, I think they potentially convey the idea of something dramatic encompassing the whole building, and I think that's not what I was intended to convey, and that's not what this data measured.
Well, we could see the numbers listed in the
Yes.
bullet points there. Some are hotels, some are pubs, some are converted flats, some are in purpose-built blocks, 13, I think, in all. So we can do the numbers on the kinds of buildings, but let me ask the question again. Do you accept that at the time of this report in November 2013, the LFB had within it the knowledge that building failure following a fire was not exceptional?
Yes.
Yeah. And as you put it last Thursday, Lacknell was not a one-off.
Lacknell was not. I'd have to be reminded of the words before and after, but yes.
Well, let me put it to you again then. As at November 2013, did you think that Lacknell was a one-off or not?
No.
No. Now, in the paragraph below that...
I'm sorry. Or had the potential not to be a one-off. So I don't recall the specifics. I can't name another building which had the same range of failures as Lacknell, but it's perfectly conceivable that they exist. And that, I think a couple of times last week I said, you could make a list of 10 items that might be involved in a particular building failure, and you might find 7 of them were a feature of Lacknell and a different 6 were a feature of another high-rise fire. But the potential for multiple failures in a single building, including a high-rise, was definitely there, yes.
Now, in the paragraph below that, you say, the inquiry should obtain this report and request the Brigade to provide information about further findings since this report. That quotes building failure, quotes, it is not a rare event, has many important ramifications, and I feel sure that the inquiry will want to address these. Is it right to say that one of those, quotes, important ramifications, your words, is that one cannot assume that a building's fire safety features will perform or remain intact during a fire?
Yes.
Yes. Or indeed that they even exist?
Yes.
Yes. And developing that further, that theme, as you do in this document, let's go to page 11, third paragraph down on that page. And you say there, underneath the heading, the response for the fire brigade, below the short introductory paragraph, you say this: the first is that the brigade's operational tactics for fighting fires and for determining the application of stay-put advice reflect many considerations and experience, but they are both predicated upon an assumption that a building does not suffer from a lack of structural integrity and that the fire safety features will perform. Both the Lacknell and Grenfell fires demonstrate that this assumption can be wrong and fatal in its outcomes. Now, is that because a stay-put policy assumes that compartmentation will hold up and that occupants will be protected from fire?
Yes.
And as you go on to say in the next paragraph, the Brigade cannot be expected to be certain that all of the buildings where they attend fires will be constructed or maintained in accordance with the regulations, and that it will perform in any specified way if a fire occurs. Now, that much was clear, wasn't it, following Lacknell?
Yes.
Yes. And that being the case, does it follow, and I would suggest to you that it does, that stay put cannot be expected or assumed to be an appropriate and safe evacuation policy for a high-rise building?
I'm sorry, would you ask again, please, Mr. Miller?
Does it follow from what you've just said, by way of answer to those questions, that stay put can't be expected or be assumed safely to be an appropriate and safe evacuation policy for a high-rise building?
Not for all high-rise buildings.
Well, for any high-rise building, I would suggest, unless the LFB has sufficient information to be able reasonably to know that the fire safety features will hold up in the event of a fire.
But
Right?
if it was an all buildings or non-buildings, so Brigade does successfully evacuate people from high-rise buildings. I don't know the detail of the recent Madrid fire where the external facade of the building burnt in a way that looked similar to Grenfell, but the internal compartmentation of the building apparently held and everybody got out. So it's not an all or nothing thing, and there's part of the difficulty, of course.
No, that's not, I think, an answer to my question. Does it not follow that given that the assumption that a high-rise building will not always perform, so far as its fire safety features are concerned, in the event of a fire, as you've accepted, does it not follow from that stay put can't be trusted?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. That being so, why did the London Fire Brigade never provide its crews with any operational materials, training, operational news articles or emails that sent a very clear message to local firefighters that building failure wasn't rare, and as a result they needed to be ready to consider and action either a full or significant partial evacuation at any time?
I think I'm genuinely trying to answer your question. I think I've learned as a result of preparation for the inquiry that there was maybe a policy deficiency. So I think Andy Rowe's statement says, sorry, there was a point last week where I was commenting on evidence, and I'm anxious not to be somewhere where I shouldn't be. But my understanding of material that's been disclosed to me is that he has acknowledged that although there were in policy, one of the policy notes, that although there was some brief contemplation of the possibility that evacuation might be necessary, that wasn't then developed in any way and certainly wasn't carried through to any training. And then the second, and Peter Cowup and Gary Reason will know much more about that. But the second reason was, I think, what the chairman referred to as stay put being an article of faith. I think that's how the Phase 1 report describes it, and I think that's a fair commentary. I know that many firefighters have views about the practicalities of evacuation, that It can't be done because of the nature of the building. Narrow single staircase, lots of kit on the staircase, and the inquiry will be dealing with all of that. So I hope that is an answer.
Did you ever ask anybody, whether the Commissioner, the Operations Directorate, Dave Brown, the Fire Safety Department, to disseminate the message to frontline firefighting responders that when they turn up to a fire in a high-rise building, they cannot assume that the stay-put policy in place for that building will hold up?
No, but there are people who are far better qualified than I am to talk to you about the approach to training for firefighters. And it isn't to predict scenario. Well, I don't know whether that's the right way of saying it or not. The approach is about dynamic risk assessment, and as part of that, to not rely upon the certainty of anything. And so the possibility of the unpredictable or the unpredicted, my understanding is that is a core element of incident commander training.
And yet, do you accept that senior officers in the LFB, and particularly the Fire Safety Department, knew, particularly after refurbishments, but knew that the stay-put policy couldn't be trusted for high-rise buildings because of the risk presented by modern materials and other things, and yet failed to share that with frontline firefighters?
No, because that idea that it couldn't be trusted, that, in my experience, that's not how I remember colleagues thinking about it, the idea that it couldn't be trusted. It's not how I thought about it until 2016. These were things I did think about even after I left the brigade. But that idea of couldn't be trusted, I don't think that was the way that colleagues thought about it, no.
Do you accept that they should have thought about it that way, and by failing to do so, failed to give local crews the tools to face the fires that they were presented with in the modern built environment?
Not directly after Lacanau, but I said last week, I think, that the revelation that Southwark and Lewisham between them had spent £80 million on fire safety improvements to their housing stock after the prosecutions was a revelation to me, and did make me think, well, what was the quality of their stock, and how reliable would stay put be in that context? There was also the Scottish schools. That was a thing about masonry, presented itself as a problem about masonry. All the focus was on the fact that the Scottish schools were built through a PFI contract. But I remember saying to a former colleague at the time, I bet you that there are as many fire safety failures in those buildings. That there are many fire safety failures in those buildings, in addition to the masonry problems, and that is what the inquiry into the Scottish schools revealed. So certainly after I left the brigade, I saw more things that made me personally think, I'm just not sure about that assumption. But that wasn't abroad within the brigade while I was there.
Well, let's just refocus, if we can, please, on the last sentence of the paragraph on the screen I was asking you about. I'll read it again. Both the Lacanau and Grenfell fires demonstrate that this assumption can be wrong and fatal in its outcomes. Now, if you ignore the words "and Grenfell fires," the sentence reads that the Lacanau fire demonstrates, if we make the changes, that this assumption can be wrong and fatal in its outcomes. Now, do you accept that the lesson from Lacanau, namely that the assumption that the stay put advice would hold was wrong, was never communicated to frontline firefighters?
I don't know that I can accurately pick my way through the fault line at Lacanel as regards stay put and the handling of fire survival guidance. And it wasn't just... I can't pick my way accurately through that. Probably others can. But I go back to the point that the approach to training was expect the unexpected, and I simply don't know whether I don't know what references to stay put were contained in the Lacanel House training that began to be rolled out in 2004. So all firefighters, fire station-based staff were required to undertake the Lacanel House training package, and there was a separate package for officers. And I simply can't speak to the extent to which, if at all, stay put was part of that package.
Now, on the 14th of June 2017, you had left the London Fire Brigade some 2 years and 3 months earlier, yes?
Yes.
When you first heard the news and you saw the images of the fire at Grenfell Tower, what was your immediate reaction?
It was like 9/11. It was something that one couldn't stop watching, and well, it was just a terrible thing.
Let
I'll
me
just take a moment.
It's okay.
No, don't worry.
And strangely enough, I'd been with a former fire service colleague on the night that the fire started. And I would have said to him, did say to him, you know, how are you getting on with that stay put business? Because I personally, you know, had my reservations about it by that time because of the three things that I've mentioned, or the two things, the prosecution and the Scottish schools, enough. It just seemed to me that, you know, just reading the newspapers in an ordinary way and listening to the news in an ordinary way, you would hear and read things that made you think, I'm just, you know, that causes me to think differently about something.
Did you ask yourself in that moment what might have gone wrong?
Oh, no. No.
Now, in light of your November 2017 submission and your evidence that you've given about it this morning, can we assume that you, maybe this is right, maybe this is wrong, but help me, did you think to yourself that this was a one-off fire that was completely unpredicted and for which the LFB could never reasonably be prepared?
In the moment, I didn't know enough about, you know, that the spread of the fire was so extraordinary that I knew as little about why that happened as everybody else at that time.
Or did you think to yourself that this was a fire, this kind of fire, which was waiting to happen and for which the LFB could reasonably be prepared?
No, I didn't think that.
Did you look back on your own time as DC and ask yourself what you could have done in that position to prepare the LFB better for a response to the Grenfell Tower fire?
Sorry, how quickly am I contemplating this question, Mr. Millett? So in the months that followed, I certainly, you know, I developed some views about things that I think could have made a beneficial impact, and I hold those views now.
And looking back now, are you able to identify anything that you think you could or should have done as DC, which 2 and a bit years on would have better equipped the incident commanders to have faced the fire at Grenfell?
No, but the two things. Actually, maybe one of my two things would have helped the incident commander. But I'm sure that my two things, I wouldn't have succeeded with them as DC.
What were the two things?
The Brigade has a system of tactical advisors, so interagency liaison officer, bulk media advisor, fire safety officer. There's a long list. Officers who are specialist officers who are mobilised if circumstances require it. Personally, I would now have a cadre of stay-put advisors, and if any high-rise fire progressed beyond 45 minutes, I'd have that officer dispatched. But I say 45 minutes because the overwhelming majority of high-rise fires, the stop message is in within about 40 minutes. So it seems to me, it's a very simple mechanism, but works for me. I think the demands of making an assessment about stay put, it's easy to imagine that would be overwhelming for an incident commander faced with an incident like Grenfell. So maybe one of those two things would. Of course, my policy intention is that it would assist an incident commander. So a stay-put advisor. And the second thing is the demands of moving information around at that incident were enormous. And we know from Lacanau that there were failures to move incident information around as well as it should have been, and they were magnified enormously at Grenfell. I believe that for some incidents, they need people who can manage information on a command unit, and I mean non-operational people who can assemble and use Excel spreadsheets, who can create one record of information that's available in control and in every corner of the incident ground and at the bridgehead. And I think that is achievable with skill, and I don't believe that that skill is going to come from the operational workforce. I think it's a specialist skill, and the Brigade ought to seriously reconsider whether it's prepared to make what would for it be a huge cultural change and recognise that there are information specialists and analysts who would do that job better in the way the police have, as far as I can see. So they have that in place. They've overcome that cultural barrier, and the Brigade would do well to contemplate doing the same, in my opinion. But although I've said those are the two things that I think, in my mind, would have made a difference or could make a difference, I don't for a minute think if I'd been Deputy Commissioner and proposed either of those two things, they would have progressed, because the cultural resistance to having people who aren't operational firefighters on the incident ground is so strong, and I think they're just not open to the idea of a stay-put specialist, and I think they should be.
You mentioned just now in your answer cultural resistance, and you gave us a flavour of it just now. Was that cultural resistance something that you came across in your own experience in your time as Deputy Commissioner?
I don't know why I'm struggling to answer. Yes, I suppose so. So, yes.
How did it manifest itself?
Look, I don't want to leave the impression, other than that, I loved working for that Fire Brigade, and it was a great job. Cultural resistance, initially being a woman was an enormous novelty. There were two of us, in fact, and people couldn't figure out why we weren't the same. So we, there was a thing about being a woman. There was obviously a thing about being a non-operational deputy commissioner. I made the information management people important in London Fire Brigade, and I know they're not that important anymore. And they did, the work they did to improve systems in London Fire Brigade, and they were systems that improved training and improved performance and improved information. Had value when I was there, and I don't think it hasn't got a sponsor in the same way, and it doesn't have the same value as it did have. So the brigade is, full of opinions and experiences, and they, it's full of different kinds of people with different views about other kinds of people. Sorry, that's not very helpful.
Ms. Dexter, thank you very much for that, and thank you for your evidence as a whole. I've come to the end of my questions that I've prepared for you. It's customary at this moment to take a break to see if there are any follow-up questions that I have or others may have for you. So I'm going to ask the chairman to take a break. You wanted to say something?
May I? It was something that I meant to do first thing, but we got off to a really quick start and I missed my moment. On Thursday morning, we talked about ODCB and the frequency of ODCB and operational news. And I'm just concerned that I may have left the inquiry with the impression that the number of ODCB meetings reduced and that the number of operational news publications also reduced, because we had a discussion about 6 monthly, which came out of the documents that we were looking at. Just having checked, and I'm conscious that I also said ODCB was arguably the hardest thing I did as Deputy Commissioner, and I don't want those two things to come together with an idea that that important thing had reduced. So in 2011 through to 2014, there were never less than 6 meetings of ODCB, and 1 year there were 9. And when we went to 6 monthly ops news, which in fact we only did in 2013 from looking at my records, it's because it expanded in size, so it went from 4 pages to 8 pages, but the following year we were back up to three editions anyway. So I just didn't want to leave the impression that this important thing was not happening as frequently.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes. Thank you, it is. Well, as Mr. Millet's explained, we have a break at this point because he may have forgotten to ask a question, but perhaps more importantly, others who are not in the room may have questions that they think we ought to put to you. So, Mr. Millet, do you think 10 minutes is going to be long enough? Would you like a bit longer?
In fairness, given the amount of time that's been
right.
in the box, let's say 15.
Yes, all right.
People have had the weekend to think of any further questions.
All right. Well, I think there's
no more than that.
There's force in that. We'll break now until 12:30, and if you need more time or if there are more questions coming in, well, you must just let us know. But subject to that, we'll come back at 12:30 to see if there are any more questions for you. All right. Thank you very much. Right, thank you, Mr. Millet. Well, we'll say 12:30, but if there's a problem, just let us know.
Thank you very much.
Would you ask Mrs. Dexter to come back in, please? All right, Mrs. Dexter. Well, we'll see whether there are any more questions for you. Yes, Mr. Millett?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Dexter, I'm glad to be able to tell you that there are no further questions for you.
There you are.
Mr. Chairman, that then concludes Ms. Dexter's evidence. But may I just make one point? Because there are still discussions going on between the inquiry team and the LFB as regards disclosure of documents, there may be some further documents in respect of which we would need Ms. Dexter's assistance. And therefore, I'm going to ask you, if I may, not to release her formally. Now, clearly it's undesirable that she should be in Purda for any longer than is absolutely necessary.
Yes.
So if I were to say until something like 4:30 tomorrow afternoon, that would give us enough time to know whether or not we need to call her back briefly to answer further questions.
And you will be able to tell her one way or the other formally whether she's required or not required, because I think she'd like to know that.
Indeed. Yes.
Yes. Yes, all right.
Thank you
very much. Right, well, Mr. Dexter, thank you very much for coming to give us your evidence. It really has been very useful to hear from you. I'm sorry it's taken a little while, but there was a lot to talk to you about, so inevitably, I suppose, it was going to take some time. Anyway, thank you very much indeed. Now, normally at this point, I would say you're free, you're out, so to speak, but as you've heard from what Mr. Millett says, it's just possible we may need your help on some other matters. So I'm not going to say that to you now. And what I am going to say is that please consider yourself, as Mr. Millett attractively put it, in Purda. In other words, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it for the next day or so. And we will contact you in the course of tomorrow, probably at the end of the day, to let you know formally whether we need to see you again or that we don't need to see you again. And if we don't need to see you again, of course, you can talk to anyone about anything you like at that point. All right? Now, I'm sorry to do that to you because I'm sure it's inconvenient, but there are reasons, as you've heard. Anyway, thank you once again, and for the time being,
thank you.
You can go.
Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Millett, we have another witness waiting, I think, have we?
We do.
We need to have a short break just for housekeeping purposes.
That would be helpful.
Yes, well, we'll rise then for a few minutes, and I suggest you send the usher to collect us as soon as you're ready.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I now call Mr. Gary Reason, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Reason.
Good afternoon.
I understand that you're going to affirm.
I am.
Right, well, the words should be on the screen if you'd read them out, please.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, please sit down, make yourself comfortable. All right, there's water there if you'd like it, dear.
Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett, when you're ready.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Reason, good afternoon, and thank you very much for attending the inquiry and assisting us with our investigations. We're extremely grateful to you. My questions are intended to be short and simple. Sometimes they turn out not to be that way. So if you would like me to rephrase the question or put it again, I'm very happy to do that. Can I ask you also, please, to keep your voice up so that the person sitting to your right can get down on the transcript what you're saying. Please also don't nod or shake your head. Please say yes or no, as the case may be. We will take scheduled breaks during the course of the afternoon and throughout your evidence, but if you feel you need a break for any reason other than those scheduled breaks, please just indicate and we can take a break.
Okay, thank you.
Now, you've given us, I think, 4 witness statements in response to Rule 9 requests. And can I show you the first one, please? It's at LFB 3032747, dated the 12th of February 2019. And if we go to the last page of that document, you can see that there's a signature. Is that your signature under the Statement of Truth?
Yes, it is.
Can we next go to the second of those statements, please? LFB 3067846. That's the second statement dated 2nd of December 2019. And if we turn, please, to the last page of that document, page 31, you'll see a signature under the Statement of Truth. Is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
Can we then go to the third of these statements, please? LFB 3086200, 8th of January 2020. And if you look at the last page on that, please, which is a 2-page statement, you'll see there's, again, a signature underneath the Statement of Truth, which is at the bottom of page 1. Is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
And then finally, your fourth statement, LFB 201044348, dated the 25th of March 2020. And again, on page 2, there's a statement of truth and a signature under it. Is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Have you read these statements recently?
I have.
And can you confirm for us, please, that the contents of each of these statements are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
Are you happy for those statements to be taken as your evidence to the inquiry?
Yes, I am.
Now, all 4 statements have a number of documents exhibited to them. Can you confirm that you've recently reviewed those exhibits?
I have.
Thank you. Have you discussed your evidence with anybody before coming here today?
No.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to begin by asking you some questions about your roles and responsibilities, and to start with some general questions. In your first statement at paragraph 2, if we can just go to that, LFB 3032747, paragraph 2, under the heading Career Profile, you tell us that you joined the LFB as an operational firefighter. Is that right?
I did.
You did. And you also go on in that paragraph, and then in paragraph 3, to explain that you worked your way up through the operational ranks before being promoted to Deputy Assistant Commissioner, DAC, in January 2007. Yes?
That is correct.
And I think it's right that you were working at the time of your promotion to DAC in the Brigade's Training and Development Department.
I was promoted into the Training Development Department, but I was a group manager in a different department before I was promoted.
And you were promoted to the Head of Training and Development in February 2008, I think.
I was.
Yes. Now, paragraph 5 of your statement, on page 2, if we can just have it in front of us, I can summarise, I think. You say that in June 2008, you were promoted from a temporary AC to a permanent AC and moved from the Training and Development Department to the Operational Resilience Department. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And your role there was head of operational resilience.
Yes, it was.
Yes. Could you give the panel a brief overview of the work or the remit of the Operational Resilience Department?
Yes, so as head of service for that department, there was a number of functions that were discharged by that department. Health and safety services, emergency planning, contingency planning, which included aspects of event planning for things like the London Marathon and New Year's Eve celebration. I also had a team that worked as a special operations group, which were the group of officers that looked at the emerging terrorist threat and developed policies, procedures and equipment provision to respond to that. And I think that's about the extent of the functions under that department.
Right. Now, you were one of three directors, I think, alongside Deputy Commissioner Rita Dexter and Director of Finance and Contractual Services Sue Budden.
That's correct.
Yes. And that is when you became promoted to Director of Operational Resilience and Training, or DOORT, or D-O-O-R-T.
Yes.
Yes. That was in January 2012. And as a director, you reported, I think, straight to the Commissioner, didn't you?
I did.
Yes. And that was Ron Dobson, wasn't it, until the end of 2016?
For the full tenure of my directorship, it was Ron Dobson was my line manager.
Indeed. And he handed over the commissionership to AC Cotton at the end of 2016 after you had left.
Yes.
Yes. And am I right in thinking that your directorate was one of two operational directorates?
Yes. Mine and the Deputy Commissioners were the two operational directorates.
Yes. And you explain at paragraph 9 of this statement, if we can just have it up on the screen, page 3, that as Director of Operational Resilience and Training, you were responsible for 6 departments, and you set them out there: operational assurance, operational procedures, human resource and development, health and safety, operational resilience, and emergency planning. Now, you've told us about the work of the Operational Resilience Department. Can you give us similarly a brief overview of the work of the Operational Assurance Department and the Operational Procedures Department?
Certainly. Just for clarification, it says in paragraph 9 that it was the department's own functions. Shortly after I took up the directorship, a number of those functions were combined into the operational assurance, so particularly the health and safety and the emergency planning function came under the operational assurance department. So it was actually 4 departments that I was responsible for the majority of my time as director.
So just graphically, we take the last 2 bullet points under paragraph 9 there, and we understand them as part of operational assurance.
Yes.
I see. Could you just tell us then what the work of each of those 2 departments, operational assurance and operational procedures, was, in brief?
Yeah, so operational assurance looked after the performance management framework for the brigade and reported to the Operations Directorate Coordination Board. Operational procedures looked after, as it describes there, operational policy. They weren't responsible for all operational policy, but the vast majority of operational procedures resided under that head of service. Human resource and development. One side of that department looked after the HR function of the brigade, so the transactional functions, the policies, equalities, diversity, that sort of thing. And the development side looked after predominantly the business processes that were in place to assist the brigade to manage the external contract, which was with Babcock, the external training contract. Operational resilience, I think I've touched on that already because I was the former head of that. Yeah. So do you want me to repeat that?
No, that's okay. Thank you. So just the first 3 you've explained. So where did training sit? Or is that too broad a question?
If the question was training vested in one head of service, the answer to that is no.
Right.
The Human Resource and Development Department was predominantly focus on, say, the business relationship with Babcock and also the training assurance process in terms of what the service provider, Babcock in this case, was delivering to the brigade. Other aspects of the brigade's training functions were vested in all heads of service who identified the training need as it was for their respective departments on an annual basis, and what I call the front line, which is fire stations training. That training and development requirement was set out in the policy. Development of maintenance and operational professionalism is the policy that I'm referring to, and that training, which was the ongoing day-to-day training at fire stations predominantly, and also the provision of exercises and other external training activities, was managed through the management functions within that directorate.
Which department?
That was, it changed its name during my time, but it's Operations, Prevention and Response, managed by Assistant Commissioner Dave Brown.
Right. That's not within your directorate?
That is not within my directorate, no.
That was sat under the DC?
It was under the Deputy Commissioner at that time, yes.
I follow. Now, you've already summarised that for us. We heard from the Deputy Commissioner, Rita Dexter, that her directorate encompassed local fire stations, control room, strategy and performance, and the fire safety department. You'd agree with that, I think?
I do agree with that.
Yes. And you say in your statement at paragraph 7, for which I think we need to go back a page to page 2, that you remain Director of Operations, Resilience and Training until you retired from the Brigade in January 2015, yes?
That is correct.
Yes. Now, for completeness, I take from paragraphs 11 to 14 of this statement, just summarising it, that you then returned to work for the LFB in June 2017 to assist with the operation of the LFB's internal Grenfell Tower Investigation and Review team.
I did.
Yes. And then is it right that you left that role, and indeed the LFB again, on the 31st of July 2019?
That is correct.
Right. Now, turning then to your responsibilities and oversight of the LFB as DOORT, can we look at your statement at paragraph 7? You say there, and this is on page 2, at the foot of the page, in the second line, the DOORT role formed an integral part of the Brigade's corporate management team, CMT, that had responsibility for the effective management and continuous improvement of the full range of prevention, protection and emergency response services provided by the Brigade. And in the rest of that paragraph, you go on to explain that at the time that the other members of the CMT were the then Commissioner Ron Dobson, Deputy Commissioner Rita Dexter, and Sue Budden as Director of Contractual Services. And as of 2013, the appointed third officer, AC Brown, David Brown. Yes?
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, we heard evidence from Rita Dexter that before the Grenfell Tower fire, this body, CMT, I think was known as CMB, or the Corporate Management Board. Is that right?
I think I'm trying to describe a different group of people.
Right, I wondered. Could you help?
Apologies for the confusion if that's what this is called. So I just used the term corporate management team to describe the top 4 managers in the organisation, because I knew that I'd probably be referring to us 4 throughout my statements, and it was a sort of a short way of describing the 4 officers. The corporate management board was an actual meeting, and the membership of that meeting was wider than the CMT as I've described it. So
Yes.
Apologies if that caused any confusion.
Formal CMB meetings involved a number of advisors, didn't they?
Yes.
I think. And those meetings were separate from the more informal CMT meetings.
Yes. So
Yes.
there was a weekly commissioners group meeting, which was the one you're describing as more informal, and then the corporate management board was a programme of meetings that were diarised throughout the year.
Yeah. So we've got. I think that's clear. The CMT, as you describe it, is the commissioners group.
Yes.
I see, and that met informally, weekly.
We tried to. We didn't always manage to meet each week, but yeah, it was certainly an intention to meet regularly.
But they were informal and unminuted, I think.
They were unminuted.
Rita Dexter
meetings,
told us. Now, having regard to your position as director and your membership of those 2 groups, CMT or Commissioners Group on the one hand and CMB on the other, would it be fair to say, in general, that you had extensive oversight and knowledge of the LFB's organisational workings and priorities?
Yes.
Yes. Were you always happy with the LFB structure that we've so far examined?
It's a big organisation. It's a complex organisation. There were an awful lot of meetings to attend at our level, but I wouldn't characterise it as being inefficient. It was just reflection of the complexity and the size of the organisation.
Did you ever have any reason to doubt its efficacy?
No, not at all.
Can we then turn to the oversight of and involvement in the training department's work, including the role of the ODCB? We established, I think, earlier that as Director of Operations, Resilience and Training, you were responsible for, as you've shown us, the Human Resources and Development Department. That, I think, became known later as the Training and Development Department, didn't it?
Yeah, I think after I retired,
Right.
there was a restructure of some of the functions and departments, and I think it was called the Training and Development Department.
Very well. Now, if we go to paragraph 4 of your statement at page 2, we can see that in April 2012, so during your time as Director of Operational Resilience and Training, the LFB outsourced its operational training to Babcock, yes?
Yeah, from the 1st of April 2012.
Indeed. And that was done via a 25-year contract with Babcock.
Yes, it was.
To what extent, if any, at all, was it your job to oversee that transition?
Well, as much as I was managing a key function that would be the direct contact with the training provider, once the contract had been signed, yes, that became a focus of my attention, particularly in the early stages of that contract, because there were some difficulties in that initial phase.
Right. So do I take it from that you didn't negotiate the contract, but you certainly oversaw its initial implementation?
No, I didn't have any direct involvement in the Future Options for Training project, and I, as you know from my statement, I only became director in the January, and the contract went live on the 1st of April, so only a matter of months. But certainly, once the contract was signed, yes, it became a key focus of my attention.
Now, the inquiry has heard evidence from Peter Groves about the LFB's Course Review Board. Am I right in thinking that you chaired the Course Review Board?
Yes, I did.
Yes. He also explained that in 2012, Babcock committed to undertake a review of all the LFB's training courses within the first 3 years of the contract, and that it was the Course Review Board that was responsible for agreeing and signing off Babcock's proposals about that. Is that right? Can you confirm that?
Yes, the contract did include a requirement on the training provider, Babcock, to undertake a course review across all of the course curricula that was in place when the contract was signed.
And as chair of the Course Review Board, is it right that you had oversight of and responsibility for Babcock's initial course review, or the ICR, as it became known?
Yeah, from recollection, the Course Review Board wasn't part of the management structures that were first implemented when the contract went live.
Right.
It became apparent to me quite quickly that given the extent of the work that was needed to undertake the course review on the Brigade side, so it was obviously Babcock's responsibility to bring forward evidence of their review and what their recommendations were, that we needed a mechanism for the Brigade, on the Brigade side, to manage understanding what the course review was presenting to us and how we would actually move forward to discharging any of the recommendations that we wanted to take forward. Because this was basically a fundamental review of all of the training that we had previously been delivering ourselves when the training function was in-house. So it was actually at my behest, if you like, to introduce another governance structure that would give all of the senior officers in the Brigade visibility of what was being recommended by the training provider, and so that we could work in partnership